This time of year, we're spending a lot of time in the garden. We're mainly focusing on harvesting flowers, putting bouquets together, and inviting guests into our field for you pick. And believe it or not, the one task that we're hardly spending any time on at all right now is weeding. So how exactly do we make this happen? Like, what's our secret to our low maintenance garden? Well, before our garden looked anything like this, it started out looking more like this. The black material that you see here is a combination of plastic mulch and landscape fabric that we lay at the start of our summer season, and its main job is to keep weeds at bay. Now, this is something that I frequently get asked about, and so in this video I wanted to discuss the differences between the various weed barriers that we use and give you a better understanding of why this works so well for us. So as always, if you're ready, let's get right to it. The more years that I grow flowers, the more reliant that I become on weed barriers of some kind. Now, this wasn't always the case. When I was just starting out growing flowers, I was very hesitant to spend money on such a large expense as landscape fabric. After all, I was trying to grow flowers on what, for me, was a large scale. The investment to cover that much land and fabric, it seemed more than I was willing to spend. And plenty of flower farmers talked about how therapeutic, weeding could be. And they talked about how if you just kept up with the weeding on a consistent basis each night, then the weeds would hardly be a problem at all. What I found that very first season is that while my garden started out as a blank slate with beautifully clean soil, that exposed soil soon became a host for waist-high weeds that quickly turned my once neatly planted garden into a jungly mess. I knew then that something was going to have to change. And so I spent the next winter researching ways to prevent my flower garden from being overtaken by weeds. Most everything I read listed landscape fabric, sort of the gold standard when it came to weed suppression, and I was convinced that landscape fabric would work for me as well. However, my plans soon changed when my dad shared with me how my grandparents had a plastic mulch layer available at their farm. Now, I can be stubborn and stuck in my ways, and so I was hesitant to really go against the grain and use plastic mulch when so many other flower farmers were talking about landscape fabric. But I do love saving money, and since a mulch layer was just there, I decided to use what I had, and we went ahead that second growing season and we laid plastic mulch in my garden for the very first time. Now, to be clear, in this video, I'm not advocating for one weed barrier over another. I simply want to share my experience having used both landscape fabric and plastic mulch. I think a lot of flower farmers aren't aware that they have options when it comes to preventing weeds, and I want to share the different pros and cons that I have experienced so that you may make a more informed choice as to what will work best for you. So let me start with a short explanation of what is fabric versus what is plastic in this garden. We are currently looking at the space in my garden that's reserved for warm season tender annuals. The flower beds themselves are covered in plastic mulch, whereas the walkways are landscape fabric. As you can see in this front row, when the transplants are young and immature, the plastic mulch is visible. However, as our seedlings grow and mature, they eventually cover the plastic mulch entirely, and all you really see in our garden, especially late in the season, is the landscape fabric in our pathways. Now, as we move over to this section of the garden, you'll notice that both the walkways and the flower beds are landscape fabric. The reason for this is because this area was originally intended as a space to grow my hardy annuals. You see, when I was first introduced to the concept of hardy annuals, I was excited to have flowers blooming in my garden much sooner than usual. I knew that I wanted to try my hand at fall planting flower varieties that were hardy to my region, but I was unsure if plastic mulch would be suitable enough to last all winter long, and so I opted to use landscape fabric for this space. So as you can see, this garden, it's a pretty good mix of weed barrier. And so let's take a closer look at what I love and also what I dislike about each of these. I think the most obvious advantage to landscape fabric seems to be the fact that it's reusable. You make the investment once and you can recoup that investment over a number of years, whereas plastic mulch is a single-use item that you have to start fresh with each season. Part of what makes landscape fabric so durable is that it's thicker and made up of tightly woven material. Plastic mulch, on the other hand, is polyethylene film that's only about 1 millimeter thick. What's more, most landscape fabrics are also UV protected, and all in all, they're advertised to last about 5 years. And there's plenty of flower farmers who say that their fabric has lasted much longer than that minimum guarantee. Despite these initial differences, the purpose of these different weed barriers is the same. The basic idea is that these are both ground covers meant to cover areas of your garden where bare soil exists so that the light is cut off to the soil below and weeds are prevented from growing. So which is my favorite and why? For me, I don't so much prefer one over the other, but in my experience, I've come to learn that certain ground covers work better in different areas of my garden. So let me explain. And before I do, I just know that I really wanted to love landscape fabric. When I was just starting growing flowers, it seemed like every flower farmer I looked up to was using landscape fabric in their garden. And I wanted to follow their lead, and do the same. But what I experienced after just one season was that there were some real advantages to using the plastic mulch that I hadn't considered before. And so I encourage you to listen with an open mind as we discuss these two different ground covers. So for me, the plastic mulch has been better at preventing weeds. And I think what makes the plastic so much more effective is the simple fact that it's less breathable. So when you lay plastic mulch in your garden space, you'll often use a mulch layer that you see here. There's a disc at the front of the machine that opens a trench on either side of the intended row. The wheels further down the machine then press the plastic down into each furrow, and a final disc follows behind to add soil back onto the furrow so that that plastic is buried and held in place. Unlike the landscape fabric that is woven, the plastic mulch is a solid film of ground cover. Weeds can only permeate areas of this ground cover where holes are cut into it. While the weave on landscape fabric is small and it would seem unlikely that weeds could grow through it, in my experience, small weeds like you find with grasses, well, they're stubborn enough that they can grow through most anything. Now, before we get too far, I do want to clarify, because I feel like so many flower farmers sell others on the idea that if you lay weed barrier in your garden, you'll never weed again. In my experience, that couldn't be further from the truth. While ground cover doesn't stop weeds from growing altogether, and I'm talking about both plastic and landscape fabric here, it does greatly reduce the weed pressure that I experience within my garden. Typically, I'll get weeds that pop up in the holes where my transplants go, and this is true for both the fabric and the plastic. The weeds are more prevalent when my seedlings are young and still too small to shade out weeds that pop up. However, as the season continues, what typically happens, especially with bulkier plants like zinnias and cosmos, the plants will become mature enough where there won't be any room for more weeds to grow. Now, not only does the limited breathability of this plastic mulch help with weed suppression, but it's also great for retaining moisture. Believe it or not, this entire section of the garden is watered with just a single row of drip tape for each 3-foot wide bed. Personally, I think that's pretty amazing, especially when you consider that each bed has 3 to 4 rows of flowers in it. Now, a big reason that we can get away with just a single row of drip tape is also partially due to our soil. There is some clay here in the soil, and that helps the water spread out just a bit. Someone that grows on more sand may experience water that drains straight down and may require just a bit more drip tape. But for us here, we're able to water with a single line of drip, and because the plastic reduces evaporation, what I find is that I can get away with watering much more sparingly. I'll water pretty deeply at planting, but after that I only have to turn on our irrigation if we go an extended period of time without rain. Even earlier this season when we were in a drought, this plastic did such a great job at retaining moisture that I was still watering only once about every 7 days. With the area in my garden that is covered by landscape fabric, I find that to keep plants watered well, I need much more drip tape. The breathability of the fabric sort of works to my disadvantage, as I have to lay one line of drip for every row of flowers that's in each bed. So for my beds where I have 5 rows of flowers, I also have 5 lines of drip tape beneath the fabric. In this instance, the drip tape definitely takes much more time to set up. Now, where I do end up saving time with the landscape fabric is with the fact that since I pre-burn holes into the fabric, my plant spacing is set before I even start planting. I lay the fabric and then I plant transplants into each of the pre-burned holes. I don't have to do any measuring, where with the plastic I'm starting with a fresh slate each year and I have to physically make new holes as I plant. Now it's not difficult to make holes in the plastic. I don't have to use a propane torch like I do with the fabric. This plastic, it tears apart pretty easily, and I find that my Hori Hori garden knife does the trick of tearing through just fine. While being able to tear easily is a plus for the areas in my garden that I'm planting into, it's not what I want for my walkways. As you can imagine, plastic mulch is much too fragile to work as a ground cover in my pathways between my garden rows. That's where I use landscape fabric. In terms of labor, I do feel that the fabric is a bit more labor intensive, especially for flower growers growing on a slightly larger scale, on a 1/4 acre or more. When you're working with large pieces of fabric, it can be heavy and hard to move by yourself. What's more, the fabric needs to be held in place with something so that it doesn't fly away in the wind. You typically don't bury landscape fabric, the same way that you do when you're using the plastic mulch. We actually use ground staples to keep our fabric in place, and that takes time, placing them into the ground at the start of our season and then removing them at the end. Compared to plastic mulch, where so long as you have, an available tractor, the machine will do most of the work for you. If I hadn't pointed out yet already, our mulch layer even lays our drip as it's laying the mulch. It really makes for a seamless and easy process that saves us from the hard physical labor of laying it ourselves. Now, if you don't have a tractor or mulch layer, you can certainly lay this plastic more manually. You likely just have to have a few people to help secure the plastic in place, and it would likely take a good amount of effort, to dig the necessary trench for the plastic to lay into, but it is entirely possible. It is worth mentioning that a lot of people have a preference for plastic or fabric, one over the other based on environmental concerns. For some people, they prefer to stay away from single-use plastic. Now, if this is you and that's your concern, I encourage you to do what's best for you. Though you may want to consider that there are biodegradable options available. While I haven't personally used Bio360, and so I don't have any experience to share with you, Bio360 is meant to be a substitute for more traditional plastic film. I believe it's derived from some sort of corn product, and it's meant to break down in your field after a bit of time. It could be something worth checking out, especially if you're wanting to lessen your environmental footprint. Now, I feel like I've really waffled back and forth with my explanation in this video and the pros and cons of plastic mulch, and that's really because I wanted to give you as much of an unbiased opinion as I could on the different ground cover options that are available in the market today. As you can likely conclude, which option is best for you will depend on a number of factors that are personal to you and unique to your situation. As with all my videos, I hope this information gives you things to consider as you decide what will ultimately work best for you. So now it's your turn. Let me know in the comments below some of the ways that you found to reduce weed pressure in your gardens. I'd love to learn new tips and tricks. Okay everyone, before you go, if you could do me a favor, if you found the information in this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button below. And as always, I will see you in the next video. Bye now.